My name is Alta. I'm from Rhodes University in South Africa.
And my name is Thom. I'm from the University of Victoria in Canada.
And we're very excited to be discussing community mapping with geo tools, mostly like Google Geo tools, obviously, because of where we are today. And it is going to be a discussion. So there's going to be the first half of the talk is going to be a little bit more of us talking, but then after that, we're going to be handing it over to you. The idea of the session is really for it to be a kind of like a brainstorming, debugging in a sense, of the challenges that we have in community mapping. So the focus is really on, well, community mapping and on challenges, but I think sort of a secondary objective is also for us to just kind of connect with other people who are kind of working in this space. So maybe, am I allowed to ask questions to the audience? I guess.
Of course, yeah, it's your session.
All right, so I mean, community mapping is a pretty broad term. The way that we are using it today in this presentation, we're talking mostly about mapping with Indigenous communities and local communities, but it can be broader than that, of course. So I was wondering if anyone would like to share what kind of community mapping they do. How many people do community mapping in the audience? Okay, great. What kind of communities do you work with? Oh, yeah, we can also just shout.
Kia ora everybody. We do community mapping with Māori communities in New Zealand, in Aotearoa, so predominantly like quite rural, isolated communities. So just depending on what they need and their wants is what we do with those communities and our families.
Great.
Yeah.
Anyone else would like to share what kind of? Sorry, Jessie.
I work with students doing both ends of the spectrum, so environmental justice-based community mapping in urban neighborhoods, and also, and that's mostly in the US, and then also rural community mapping, mostly in Africa.
Okay.
I do work with the pastoral community in Kenya, northern Kenya, and I don't know if it's the same thing, but the mapping we do is more of participatory mapping, where you get them and sit them down, and they like try to tell us the historical lion corridors.
Okay, fantastic. Yeah, so I mean, I think both of what Brian and I are going to be talking about is more in the kind of the rural participatory mapping kind of space. There'll be many challenges that would maybe be relevant to you or that you may be familiar with. You may think about some other challenges that you have that we don't speak about, and certainly like in an urban space, there would be different kind of challenges that than we would be talking about here. So anyway, so we're going to talk through two examples and some of the challenges that we have here, and then we're going to we'll have a little bit of discussion around those examples. Also, for those of you who are just here to learn and are interested in the space a little bit more, you can just listen, but you can also ask questions. And then what we'll do after those two examples is we're going to open it up a little bit more and think about, especially like drawing on those of you who are working in the space, some other challenges that you either might want to have solved or that you have experienced and may be able to offer some insights on. So that's what we're going to do.
Exactly.
So I'll hand over to Brian.
All right, thanks. So, and you can tell this is like two professors leading a session, right, as we're asking for people to raise their hands and so on. I was thinking, okay, this is pretty fun. But so I'm a professor in the Anthropology department at the University of Victoria, and about 12 years ago I founded our university's ethnographic mapping lab. So this is where we employ kind of classic anthropological techniques of ethnography, working with communities, listening deeply, engaging a whole range of kind of records over time and space to think about why the land is important and how we might represent that cartographically. And in our lab, what we've really found over the years is that honestly, some of the greatest tools to do this with have been the Google Geo tools. Google Earth Pro, Google Earth Web, Google MyMaps. These are really powerful, simple, low barrier to access, free tools that can be used wisely and powerfully by communities. So, often when I'm working on southern Vancouver Island with Indigenous communities who have outstanding issues in relation to their land rights, the conflicts with unwanted extractive development in their territories, a desire to mobilize their Indigenous knowledge with future generations, with the youth and so on, I often hear the elders say, just show them our maps. Show them our maps, show them our names, show them our important places. And so a lot of these kind of questions get driven from the community's desire to make some maps, to make these powerful images that can have impact in the world and on many different scales. And so, in the old days of anthropology, we used to make these kind of maps that would have these kind of, boundaries of Indigenous peoples' territories that looked suspiciously like European state boundaries of what the territories look like there. And so our partners are pushing us to think about kind of cartographic landscapes differently. How do we story our maps? How do we bring our cultures and our histories and our connections to places out in the maps? And this is my favorite painting by the artist Lawrence Paul Yaqualuptum, who it's a painting called Usufruct. And I think our kind of goal in our ethnographic mapping and our community-based mapping with Indigenous peoples is to get to this, where every figure in this painting represents a story. It represents a connection to land. It represents a lineage and a practice and a teaching. And so how can we do this kind of thing? That I think is the standard that we're looking for. And so in our practice as anthropologists, we work on deep listening. So spending a lot of time with people, working in a slow way, working, as we've heard sometimes, at the speed of trust, right? As you're building relationships and thinking through how we can share information, document information, protect sensitive information, but also deploy our representations in powerful ways. And I think that sort of slow working, listening deeply, having the long conversations, devising numerous ways to kind of collect information from people and have people be in control of that process as much as possible is a key kind of element of the work. So you can see here in a nice example of a kind of typical map that might come out of a project in Google Earth where we're documenting relationships to the land, fishing sites, village sites, historic sites, sacred sites, and so on, and representing those. So a couple of methodologies. One is doing field work, going out and actually being in the places that are important to people, carrying your GPS with you, and your tape recorder, and bringing those, maybe even your video camera, visiting places, having people tell their stories. It's a really, really rich way to engage with local knowledges, but it's very slow. You can only visit so many places in a day, or in a week, or in a month, and then that was just with, the 50-year-old, and now you want to do it again with the 70-year-old, or you want to go out on a boat ride and everything. So this is like the slow and expensive way to do this, but it's very, very rich. We often get incredible stories and remembrances and sort of incidental information that comes in that can be impactful. In other ways, people's concerns, it's like about development and things as they're recalling what's important in the past. So this is an example of a project we did supported with the Edelman community in Kamchatka, who was facing unwanted development in their territories and had faced a series of dislocations and relocations in the 1950s. And the elders were documenting with the youth in their community some really important places. that they wanted to have locally. They didn't have amazing connection to the internet, but they did have a connection. And so we were able to cache the imagery in Google Earth on the computers in the schools. The kids were able to take the GPS locations on their phones, because even though we're in a remote community, everybody had at least a basic phone, and then we were able to create a nice project that tells these stories over the space. But another really maybe a little bit faster way of having these conversations is what has been coined by Steve DeRoy, who's often at these meetings, as the direct-to-digital method. And it's a marvelous technique using Google Earth, where we take Google Earth, we put it, we have somebody operating a laptop, we'll project it on the screen, and then we have like an interview lead that has a conversation with people about the important places in their cultural landscapes, and we fly to those places and give the person a laser pointer, and they can point it out, and the skilled Google Earth operator is sitting at the computer dropping place marks and polygons down. The event is video recorded and audio recorded, so we can go back later and attach the transcript of the commentary that people had about the places. And so this is, you can see, as opposed to getting out in boats and snowmobiles and so on and visiting, you can visit these places in Google Earth and make a very, very powerful and effective maps using this direct-to-digital method. But there's lots of ways to do this, not only in these kinds of direct-to-digital formats. This is a more recent project that we've been working on in collaboration with Thom Nation on the south coast of British Columbia and beautiful Sunshine Coast. And here we created a series of Google Earth maps with a grid and integrated that grid into a survey. And so we started collecting survey responses about places that were important in relation to the exercise of modern day treaty rights. And then we were able to compile that information back for Tla'amin Nation government as they are trying to make decisions about where economic development should happen, where land protection should happen, where cultural places should happen. So, more of a survey design to blend in with the kind of Google tools, like a Google Earth image like this. And oftentimes the Google Earth image is the right image. It's the place that people can really see. Even more than Google Maps, I would say, in my experience, people love to just open up the Google Earth, zoom in, scroll around, find their places, say, yeah, we're in area C4. That's where we're doing our fishing here, and then we can document that in the survey. And in this case, in fact, we didn't need the Google Earth experts and a whole series of video recorded interviews and all that kind of thing. This was just a survey that we hired young people in the community who are community members to go out and do with community members. We got hundreds of households, a very statistically significant sample of households, and I think really solid results. Sometimes communities ask questions that aren't just about drawing their knowledge out and representing it onto the map. Sometimes they're asking us to do other things. So, community mapping isn't just about this kind of local knowledge. It can also be about deploying Earth Engine to answer local questions around deforestation in this case, or creating a MyMap about shellfish closures and fishing closures and the kind of like conflicts of these sort of industrial contaminants on fishing sites. And we've used MyMaps for a series of about 25 of these kinds of different concerns around the territories to surface and share with the community to highlight what some of their concerns are about things where they live. Training is so important in our community-based work. It really, enabling people to do this themselves is so crucial. So holding workshops, holding small sessions in communities or big sessions like what we have here at Geo for Good, because these Google Earth tools, they can be trained in a matter of a few days, a bit of practice, some quality control, and I think really, really empowering for people to be able to do this work themselves, not necessarily relying on too much outside expertise. So I wanted to conclude with one small example about how a simple Google Earth map can be put together and leveraged for really vital impact to protect the values that are associated with Indigenous landscapes. And so this is our most recent project, which around indigenizing municipal land use planning. And so here is an urban community which an Indigenous community had been displaced from in the 1850s. This is on southern Vancouver Island, not far from the city of Victoria. And for years, the urban planners really didn't bring Indigenous people into the map at all. Heritage was basically colonial houses. Cherished the sort of natural landscapes were the parks and an old English garden that had been made. And so when the new 20-year plan came into this municipality, we engaged with a dialogue around how to bring Indigenous values, Indigenous visions of the future into conversation with what the municipal land use planners were doing. And what really sparked and created the political leverage in order to achieve a very significant input of Indigenous peoples into this plan was this simple Google Earth map that we put together in a span of about 2 weeks, honestly. It wasn't a great, big, long project. We brought in information that we could find in the library. We compiled some information from some archaeologists. We had some oral history work that we did in fairly rapid order in the community. We created this Google Earth map, and we had a meeting with senior planners. And they were like, wow, we had no idea that this was here. We were speaking in the spatial language. We were translating across the sort of words from the elders to the words that the planners, the visual kind of language of planning. And as a result, after several years that this land use plan was in process, including bringing ceremony into the work, bringing points of acknowledgement that was organized by the leadership. The mayor and council unanimously passed the revised land use plan, and of about 120 pages in the plan, about 90 of those pages have Indigenous values and goals for the future. It really has reshaped the direction of this community, and I can definitely say that the big spark for that was the Google Earth map. And then the sustained conversation around the details went to the Google Earth map, but that KML file wasn't handed over to the city for the city to decide what to deal with it. We were respecting the data sovereignty of the community. The community kept control of that. It was them who had the Google Earth project on their laptops that they shared just enough that they were able to have their impactful objectives. So we each are going to conclude our little examples with these challenges. I'll just very briefly, sort of point out a few challenges in all this. The one challenge that I often find is scoping out the work is hard. Communities have a lot of objectives, and we may have a lot of, as partners, as people who are facilitating and enabling this work, may have lots of skills we can bring to the table. Oh yeah, I can do that Earth Engine project as well as that community mapping project. And so good work takes time. You need to have lots of dialogue up front about setting priorities and drawing in multiple tools and multiple workflows and working at a pace that is realistic for the goals that you have. The second challenge is building skills but then also coming back for quality control. So just like undergraduate students, their first paper isn't so great, but by the time they're in fourth year, they're doing a great job. Generally speaking, you can see the trend, right? And so, they need the feedback. They need the people to mentor. And so in all of this work, doing one training isn't enough. It's building in time to come back and checking in on the details and giving people some mentorship and that kind of work can, I think, facilitate getting a much better quality results for the community in the long term. And then the third challenge I would say is building for data sovereignty and mobilizing for impact. So thinking right up front about all those issues around how can we make sure that all of this information is in control of the community, and I think working in the language of KML is very favorable for that. Even if we're working in the cloud, working through a Gmail account that the community established and having the MyMaps associated with that account and so on, you can build those kinds of foundations of that data sovereignty right from the get-go in the project, but also thinking about not everything has to be secret, and some things you want to have for impact. Some things do need to be shared. And so having those conversations up front, we often find that there's a kind of like a little dance around the issues of what can be outward facing and what can be inward facing. And so thinking about that issue of impact, thinking about what you want to change and how strategically you can mobilize these powerful tools, these mapping tools to make that change, and having those conversations very explicitly. People don't always know all the details, and so bringing that out has been an important part of the work. So from Canada to South Africa.
Great. Shall we just take like a couple of minutes for any questions that you might have for Brian at this point?
Or do you want to save it for later?
Okay.
Let's save it for after you're done.
Okay, great. So I'm going to be talking about a slightly different example, but I think a lot of the same themes will come out. Maybe here working at the speed of government, so not a hell of a lot faster. All right, so this is about a project that has been running. It's officially come to an end, but it's still kind of growing. Its momentum is carrying it forward. In the Tsitsa catchment in South Africa. And so, sorry, this is a really crappy map, but just to show you more or less where that is. This is South Africa. It's the Eastern Cape. It's the rural Eastern Cape, sort of right at the top of the province there. And what you're seeing in this top map is the catchment where this project is taking place. So I'll explain a little bit more what's in that map in a second, but just to explain that how this project came about was that the government wanted to dam the main river that runs through this catchment, and before they could do so, or when they were planning to start damming this river, build this big dam, they were advised that they needed to restore the catchment first. There's very, very erodible soils in this catchment, and a lot of degradation, quite a bit of overgrazing over the years. And so, that dam would be built and silted up in no time if there wasn't some restoration that took place first. And so with a little bit of sort of foresight, they decided, as sort of a consortium of partners, which included the government, decided that they wanted to embark on this project, taking a more kind of social ecological approach, and engage with the people who are actually living in the catchment to restore the catchment, not only so that they can build a dam there. And by the way, I think it started about 8 years ago. The dam has not been built. I don't think it's going to be built, but to improve livelihoods to improve livelihoods for people living there, but also to improve the ecosystem functionality, ecosystem services in that catchment. So that's how this project started. The project, just a little bit more context, is that all the green that you see in this top map is kind of communal land. So this was in the old homelands in South Africa that were created during apartheid. So communities were mostly moved from where they were living to these areas, living in these kind of small communal villages. So all the black points on the map there represent a village. On the other hand, the sort of the grey area, that is outside of the homeland. So this is like the old homeland. So this is outside of the boundary, and that's like a lot of plantations and farmland, mostly in that area. Most of the Tsitsa project actually focused on this other side, the T35E kind of subcatchment, which is also where the dam was going to be built. So one of the things that needed to be done to do this kind of work was to hear from the people who were living there. And there were lots of processes that people, that happened, that ran, where people engaged in many different forums. But critical to this whole process was also spatializing the information, like getting a sense of what's actually happening on the landscape, because that was really important for understanding like where to invest in terms of like restoration, and also like where not to go, and where not to do things that would be undermining people's livelihoods and well-being. And so that's where a lot of the kind of community mapping came in. So this project actually had a number of different kind of elements of community mapping. I'm not going to be talking about all of them. So just sort of 3 things. The one is maybe like a little bit on the edge of community mapping, but there was a real need to monitor water in the catchment at different points in the catchment on the river, both in terms of water quality, also like obviously sedimentation was really important, using these kind of citizen technicians. And so there was a big project using ODK, which is a little bit of a kind of a different, I think, view on community mapping. Then there is even, I'm going to talk about the middle one last, because that's the example I'm going to be talking about. There was even a need to communicate among different people who were working on this project. So there were people working on the ground, like community liaisons, community partners, working on the ground, having input, doing kind of restoration activities. There were the practitioners, from the government who were actually like doing sort of deciding where the restoration was going to happen. Lots of different academic partners, more social academic partners, more ecological ones. And there was a need to communicate spatially between all of these different partners. So I know that's more like sort of on the edge of community mapping, but that was kind of one element of it as well. And then the middle one that I wanted to talk about, that was probably the most important spatial part of this project, was to work with communities to figure out like how to prioritize prioritizing restoration priorities, identifying restoration priorities, and also understanding people's livelihoods from a kind of a spatial perspective. And those 2 things go hand in hand, where people, the places that are important to people, not only in terms of their livelihoods actually, but also in terms of the kind of relational values and just the way that they connect to the landscape, those also obviously fed into areas that were important for restoration. So yeah, that's the example that I'm going to be talking about. And so there's just maybe to very quickly talk about like what we actually did. So the livelihood kind of values, connection to the landscape, that kind of work happened sort of in smaller focus groups all along in different villages. And then, similar to what Brian described before, we go with sort of Google Earth most of the time, and kind of set up a direct-to-digital setup, get people to, zoom into places that were close by to them or like in the immediate surrounding, and get them to talk about like what was important, how they were using different resources to supplement their livelihoods, or what places were important to them. And so that was kind of one data set. But then there was also another kind of approach that was much more directly around prioritization. So where it was more kind of almost a technical thing where people were like, okay, now we're going to insert gabions in the catchment. Where should we do it? And so they would take the information that was collected previously in these kind of like more livelihood surveys and discussions, as well as like various other kind of community workshops. They would kind of use that to inform their kind of initial process, and then they would sit with a group of people to identify using Google Earth like where these priorities should be. Okay, so I'm going to talk about the challenges that we experienced doing that. So as Brian said, it's very, very powerful. You're able to, even in South Africa, where the imagery isn't always as good as in other parts of the world, you're able to go and really, like you can really see in great detail what it's a very true representation of what people can relate to, You can zoom in and out, and people can situate themselves in the landscape very easily. Well, sort of easily, which is going to be one of the challenges that I talk about. So the first challenge, and I would love to hear how from the pastoralist, because I imagine that's even more of a challenge if you're working with pastoralists, is just a logistical one. You know, the connectivity, electricity, the space to kind of do this work. I mean, honestly, in South Africa, electricity is a space even in cities because we have load shedding all the time. But obviously, like if you go into kind of rural landscapes, even houses that do have electricity, often that electricity isn't. It's not a very strong connection. And you also have to think about how to, you know, the fact that that costs people money. And so to make sure that you kind of compensate people for that electricity, sometimes even bringing your own electricity, like bringing a generator and making sure that there is electricity. In this case, in most of the catchment, there's actually pretty good cell phone signal, so that wasn't a huge problem, but that can be a problem. In other projects that we've worked, there might not be a good mobile data section signal, and in those cases, you know, like caching Google Earth has been is a great strategy. Also bringing a bunch of backup paper maps just in case is always a good way to go. You can always digitize it afterwards if needed. Then Brian spoke about this, around the first challenge. Another issue that we had is that often in some places there wasn't actually a space where a lot of people could come together, and sometimes the only place that was really there was like sometimes a church or a school or something like that that could work. Not always. Like sometimes there was no windows, and we actually like had to bring sheets to make sure that it's like dark enough to project things. I mean, silly things, but really important, like practical things that you have to think about. I have sheets in my bags too. Yeah, no, that definitely. But in some places, especially the really small places, there's not even that. And so then it might be the only place for people to get together, and it only packs so many people as maybe the chief's house. And that also, you know, like you have to think about, that comes with some ethical concerns as well, like who participates and who doesn't get to participate when it's all, you know, when it all has to go through sort of the chief in this case, or some sort of a central authority figure. Spatial literacy, Brian spoke about this. There's two levels to this. The first is people who you are engaging with, and then the other part of it is people who are actually doing the engagement. So I'm talking about this project, but I did very little of this engagement myself. Like these were community liaisons on the ground, in some cases students, in some cases community partners. So it takes a little time to build up those skills, and especially the confidence to be able to do this work. And the big skill is not actually like the technical skill. Like using Google Earth, people get that pretty quickly, but it's also the facilitation skills, the ability to run this process with people that are often also elders, which can be very intimidating and requires a little bit of navigation and time, just time. The other kind of part of it is that not, especially with elders in the communities, the idea of Google Earth is very foreign. Like some of them get used to it, and it is quite actually exciting. I think one person mentioned this idea of I can't remember exactly, but like it's sort of a bird or like something flying over them and taking pictures, which they thought were fascinating. But not everybody gets into it. And so we often do have to use sort of a combination of Google Earth and paper maps, just because some people feel more comfortable with it. And it also takes some people a long time to actually orientate themselves spatially. There's a huge variation in how quickly people take to maps. And then the third one I just wanted to briefly mention is it's ethics. I think in many communities, or from listening to Brian and Steve and Mocha talk, many Indigenous communities in Australasia, Northern America, is like they're more aware of ethical risks of sharing data. In South Africa, we didn't get, well, in our engagement, we didn't get that. People were very happy to share their information all the time. So the kind of ethical risks to them were not necessarily all that evident. And so I think there's a huge responsibility, especially when you're going fresh into a community with these kind of techniques and technologies that people might not be familiar with. They might also not link that to risks for themselves. And so it's really important to be having those kind of conversations so that you do get to a point where you can say, okay, these are the things that are worth sharing, but these are the things that we should keep to ourselves. And that obviously also links to data ownership and data management. Who does this belong to? How does it manage? What happens to the data? Those conversations are, I think, non-negotiable. Yeah.
So I think what our plan now, I think we should invite if there are any questions on our two examples. And meanwhile, our thought was that we shouldn't just be lectures like talking to you, but invite from you any kind of issues in community mapping that you'd like to talk about. And maybe you're cool with raising your hand, say, hey, what about this? But also go to the Jamboard and drop a sticky note for us about something that you'd like us to discuss or to raise or to share our experiences on. So if you want to use the Jamboard, we have it there. But also we welcome, and we have the two TAs with the microphones for the broadcast. It's better if you speak to the microphone because it's being recorded so that other people can watch it later. So yes, questions or yeah, please.
I had a question about this issue of spatial literacy, particularly when you were talking about the Canadian experience and the walking through, because sometimes the spatial aspect of the stories isn't necessarily something that's understood in plan, like it's a view shed, a way of mounting a scene from a particular angle, and how do you connect that?
I love this question. It's actually such a crucial question. So the classic problem for me is I'll be doing the field work, we're on the boat, we've got the lav mics on, the video recorder going, we've got our Google Earth map running on a Surface tablet usually, and we're ready to drop those points down, and then somebody says, you see that island over there? And it's this little island, and then they start revealing the story of it. And it's going to be like half an hour boating to get a GPS point to that island. It doesn't make sense to do that. So of course, we can document where they're talking about without the GPS. The GPS, there's no magic in it. I can see what the island is. And it's about documentation. So if you're not really sure what that island is, you have to take a photo, you have to do triangulation, you have to do work back in the lab once you get back. There's quality control. That's what I was meaning by quality control. It's fine to wave your hand and say the island out there somewhere, but it actually is quite material. So yeah, letting people attach their stories to those spaces. And then we have all the debates about, well, what do I do with that spatial representation? When they mention the island, is that a point? Or when they mention the island, do I circle the island? Do I do a sort of a sloppy circle around the island? Do I do some sort of tight fit to the geometry of the island? And I think that a lot of that depends on the kind of use case. What's going to happen with the data later? What is the purpose of the data? Myself, I tend to go for island sheds and watersheds. I tend to like the sort of like spatial representations with a footprint, acknowledging that it's not everywhere, but it's also not just like an XY coordinate. But in the field, sometimes it's easier just to drop a pen down and make the spatial annotation later. So building those workflows into your project planning are important. It's not just the field trip, it's coming back, it's working with I'm glossing as quality control, but I'm dealing with all of these kinds of like spatial management issues back in the lab. Yeah. Oh, lots of hands.
Great.
Awesome.
This is a question for Brian, but it touches on the ethics question that Alta brought up. I'm curious about data privacy and sort of the understanding about how the data is going to be used, but not in the geographic sense, but the audiovisual material that you're collecting. What is sort of understood at the time, when you talk about putting a lav mic on someone and you're recording that.
Yeah.
What is the understanding? How is that understanding sort of codified about how that data is going to be used and where it's going to live?
All those are such good questions and such important questions. So as a university researcher, of course, we bring out the ethics consent booklet, which has 6 pages of detailed disclosures about those sort of things. Oftentimes what we do for our work is that we don't actually keep the data at all. And we centralize the data in the community, whatever the representative organization is that we're working with, whether it's with a small NGO within the Indigenous community or oftentimes it's within Indigenous government, and they're the repository, they're the owner. They can license us to use the data if they so should choose. As a professor, it's doing the tenure track routine. It's been difficult because I don't get to publish most of the maps that we create. These maps are the community's maps that are for them to share and to publish or to not. And all of those recordings go into their archive. Where they don't have an archive or where they want to leverage the university's resources to steward these things for the long term, we have those conversations. But generally, yeah, all the stuff goes back, and I don't have much to show for it at the end of the day as a university researcher. But I think that those are the principles of the data sovereignty, right? That's what it really is up to the communities to do that and to take that control, and but also our responsibility to resource that. So we've been talking this year at UVic about how we can be making archival portals for communities to use and us to fund, so that we curate something that we have, that is controlled by communities in terms of access and that sort of thing. So yeah, institutions can be helpful.
Can one thing to just say is that from our perspective is that in South Africa we have far to go with data sovereignty specifically, because it can be hard to know who in the community can actually take who should be the custodian of the data, and it's often like in this case it was a government funded project, so then it's the data should be made available publicly. I think in those cases where it's not so clear, it's the point about having 6 pages of consent forms, and then people, it's transparent about what they are agreeing to, but they don't necessarily engage with it. So then I think that engagement is even more important to explain this is where it's going to end up with. But yeah, we have a lot to learn from you guys there.
I've got the mic. So 2 questions that are related, that are not technical questions, but more process-related questions that I have heard are used in participatory mapping, and I'm wondering if you all have had experience with either of these. So one is about sort of the power dynamics of when you go into a community. I think you've mentioned that, if you are at the elder's house or it's only certain members that are sort of allowed to speak, have you worked with those who may have been underrepresented within those groups to get their opinions about places too? So that's the first question. And then the second one is, again, I've also heard it done in participatory mapping, where you really literally start with a blank page and not any kind of Google Earth, no imagery, no maps, and just have people express their sense of place and see what happens, see where they draw, this is relative to here, to there, and then share, existing maps or images. So.
Sure. So the power thing is a real thing, and of course there's a process of that you have to engage with the chief and the headman. It's just respectful, and that's the protocol. The way that typically in these situations. I mean, in this case, it's also not like super sensitive information, but like still people have opinions about what's valuable and what's not valuable. But we've gone the focus group route where you explicitly ask for, groups of maybe traditional people who would know about traditional medicine, or people who would know about like wood collecting. And so that way you do get diverse groups. In some places the chief wants to be everywhere, like in all of those groups, and that like really undermines that the sort of the power sharing. And that's not ideal, but in most cases it ended up that we could have the different groups. And then I think in terms of your other questions, I mean, this project not so much, but in other projects that we've done, we've certainly combined participatory mapping with other participatory methods, which might be something like a blank canvas, but it also might be other kind of PRA type exercises where people try and map things, but in a different way, like in the sand or with stones, or in a timeline or an almanac or something like that. But so combining different methods to also like triangulate and making sure that you don't miss something because people don't necessarily think in a spatial way.
Maybe I'll just speak to the second question briefly, and it just made me think about timelines and working slow or working to an urgent deadline. And so sometimes the need for the map is some kind of very spatially constrained issue, and you have to go have those intense conversations about those things. In other times, I know I worked on a 10-year project where we didn't have like an urgent deadline. We just needed to ask people what was important to them, and as that map compiled with hundreds and then thousands of places of things that were important to them, we would end up then having a development, like a pipeline would be built, and they would say, okay, we need to know everything we need about this pipeline area. And sure enough, the darn map was blank there because people's attentions weren't focused on that. So there is a bit of a kind of, if you have a lot of time, a beauty in leaving it open and letting people share what's important to you, because you're going to learn about, the first ancestors who fell from the sky, and like all the sort of big philosophically important things, and the nature of social relations, and all the things that sort of, in fact, the indigenous legal orders that underwrite the kinds of attachments to place that they have. But you also sometimes need to really get focused and be motivated by whatever urgent decision is being made, and then you're fixed in these more methods, standard methods. On the first question, I'd just say that the expert interviews always end up with these dynamics of the people who aren't in the room who ought to be. One of the ways that we've been able to notice and navigate this is by when we do something like a survey, like a household survey, when we're out now to like 700 houses, and we get a pretty good response rate usually, and we'll meet people that, we didn't know, and people who want to have a conversation, not only answer the questions on the survey. And we can bring that information back and say, well, we were talking to this other family, we'd like to arrange to have an expert interview with them. So having both kinds of methods deployed is a way to navigate those relationships. It's not flawless, though.
Oh, yeah, I did, but
Yeah,
I
please
think
do.
Please,
Yeah, we
yeah.
want to hear from you.
I think it's awesome to hear that you don't expect to have papers done, or like even though you're doing copious amounts of mapping and monitoring and all those kinds of things with Indigenous communities. I think that's one of the biggest things for us in Māori communities, is that people come into our communities and then expect to like roll out a copious amount of papers for their particular groups or things like that. So that is really heartwarming to hear the integrity and the ethical conscience that you have. And I think that is something that sometimes lacks in this space for Indigenous communities throughout the globe. I think that's very few and far between happens. And like you say, especially with points, when people do point out, when you're in the field, people point out particular points, and then that point then could be quite contentious and then can become quite detrimental to that place, to the planning, and can really have some huge impacts, oftentimes negative impacts on what happens in that community. So it does help to do like a whole buffer zone of that particular area, especially when it comes to things like forestry or things like that, where somebody's put a point in and then a harvest crew will come in and harvest everything around except for that point, rather than having a whole buffer zone and then they leave the whole place alone, so to speak. So I think things like that, and even with the integrity of the ethics, I think also revisiting that throughout your project is really important, because it comes up constantly, where the protection of the data and the protection of the information is really important, and so that trust has to be always visited throughout, and even like workshops of, we had like paper, like a red paper, amber paper, and green paper of scenarios, of different scenarios of, so is this okay? And that was like a group session. And then we would have like scenarios like, is it okay to share information about this particular place, or this particular, say if a PhD student was coming in and they came from that particular tribe and they wanted to use the information that was collected for their PhD, and then everybody replies, is it red light, green light, orange light? So, and then the whole group sees that as well, and then we'll have a discussion on whether that's okay, and people will give their like explanations why they chose green light, why they chose red light. So I think, just simple things like that really help to help your project along as well, and that everybody's aware of the situations, and there's no, it's transparent. So, yeah.
Those are fabulous examples of that kind of transparency and sovereignty. So thanks for sharing.
It's hugely important. I think it's so important.
Yeah.
And it really helps with the success of programs as well, both within, because we have it as well, like as an Indigenous person myself, like there's always trust issues as well. So you have to build that trust up as well within your own community.
I just wanted to say that we work very closely with a pastoral community, and one of the key things that we've learned over time is to actually go in, and the first thing you want to do is understand that community, how they operate. And when you understand that, you're definitely going to figure out ways in which to actually engage them fully. And trust issues, just as she said, is like a very, very key one. You gotta go in, build your trust with them, because once you create that trust between you and them, then definitely you're going to get like all the information you have. I mean, some of the challenges is like actually making sure that in your groups a number of people don't speak. But basically one of the ways we're like trying to do this is like split them into small groups. So we'll have women in like separate, or like a separate day. I mean, like young teenagers like in a different group, and also probably the men like in a different group, and actually get them to draw out blank papers, like actually starting out from, or just like in soil, like drawing using stones and everything, which I like was very, very helpful for us. Then later on use that, because they'll give you names of like this hill is called this, and later on actually just get that information and draw it out on Google Maps or whatever like you're using. So one, trust, understanding the community, how they operate, and actually utilizing that. And also two, figuring ways in which to engage everyone, so that at least to get like a robust information when it comes to that. Thank you.
Can I ask you one thing, because I'm very curious? For the pastoralist, do you use sort of digital tools, or do you use sort of more paper tools mostly?
When we were out, we actually used more of like materials, like
Right.
not digital ones, but you actually papers and drawing on sand and using like stones and everything, whatever like you could get, and later on digitizing that on a map
Right.
and actually sharing with them, because it's very, very important when you go with like maps with like everything, they get like more distracted towards that. But if you go with like plain paper or like a ground, depending on which group you're engaging, then actually get more information than you coming up to the paper. So what we'll do is just go, and this we did while we were trying to map out like lion corridors. Historically, where were like lions using, and they'll say, oh, they follow that river, they go around that hill, they surely like stay in this particular forest, and they'll give you names. So later on, use those names to actually use Google. Are we using Google Earth to actually digitize those? So first, no digital, just mapping on paper on the ground, and then actually using that to digitize your data.
Awesome.
Just thinking that why we're at Google talking about these things again, and just coming back to an earlier point that I made, around trust and around these kinds of sovereignty issues, I really find that using these kinds of tools like Google Earth Pro on the desktop, where people understand that file is on your hard drive, it's not out in the cloud somewhere. It doesn't require somebody with a 4-year degree operating as a GIS technician to manage the file and steward the data and everything. Like the Google Earth material is very low barrier in terms of being able to manage and care for and create that kind of information. And so I think even moving into contexts like Google MyMaps, thinking about how those may be shared in the suite of the sort of Google Drive framework of being able to choose people to share it with, or share it unlisted, or embed it in a website and make it public if that's part of the outcome result. But again, it doesn't take somebody with a very sophisticated knowledge of coding and web applications and so on to make a very stunning and impactful web map. So I think it may be that the community that you're working with has a GIS office, and there can be workflows that you can build that bring your KML into a shapefile and so on. You can plan those things at the beginning if that might be the trajectory of the data, but also leaving rich KML around is and drawing out those rich KML. They're very effective for this kind of operating at a level where communities feel that they're in control of what they have.
Maybe can I add something
Yeah.
small to that? What we found in this project specifically is that this was obviously there was a strong focus on what this project wanted to achieve, and there was engagement with communities to help achieve that in a sort of a good way. But what was so interesting to see is that once people had the tools, in this case, I would say both Google Earth and ODK, those two kind of like the mobile data collection tools. It was so great to see like how people just started using it for their own purposes, for whatever they needed to use it for, which wasn't, like any scientific research project or like restoration project or whatever, just things that they needed to do to get on with their lives.
I want to just leave with an exciting example of that. So we've been doing this Google Earth work in the Hul'qumi'num communities in the southern Gulf Islands in southwest British Columbia. And there's a small Indigenous NGO called the Hul'qumi'num Lands and Resources Group. And they've been funded various small fundings from all kinds of sources, and they got some climate change funding. And this group is a group of people who really care about clams and digging for clams and clams in terms of food sovereignty. And so last winter and over the course of the pandemic, a number of the high knowledge clams harvesters weren't able to gather with this group, but they set about in Google Earth to go to every clam beach that they could find in Google Earth and put a place mark out there and write their concerns, their climate change concerns. Oh, this beach is experiencing more erosion. Oh, this beach is protected and we really need to make sure it stays that way. Oh, this beach, and so on. And so that's this awesome, small, private, well, it's not small, there's like 700 points on it, Google Earth map that was just totally like the community just said, yeah, we can do that. And they did it. And these aren't nerdy people sitting at computers. These are grassroots clam harvesting. The group who did it were men who made this incredible map because they're concerned about climate change and they wanted their small environmental NGO to identify to government, these are our priorities for mitigating climate change damages to important beaches. So it's just that little example that all this kind of work percolates out into something else and then they have that kind of impact. I know it's time, so we're done.